Well, I would like to welcome our viewers and listeners to the Return on Intelligence podcast. And today I'm speaking with Craig Basford, the Executive Vice President of Product at Absorb Software. Thank you for joining me, Craig. Craig and I worked together for many, many, many years. Always enjoy conversations with you, Craig. And today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence and its role in business and learning and development. And I'm quite excited to speak with you about this today.
Well, likewise, Al. Thanks for having me.
So, Craig, I think, why don't we back up a bit and talk about just over the last 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years, when we were going to market at Absorb, we would run into, folks talking about AI and artificial intelligence. And I think back then, a lot of times it was a lot about machine language more than AI, whereas now I think we're starting to see artificial intelligence being developed into solutions. So why don't we start back there and just talk about the difference to the audience and what you've seen over the years as, when you're thinking about product, not just for Absorb, but I know you think about it, in broader terms. Maybe just talk about the difference between machine language and AI and how that's just continued to evolve.
Sure. So you can think of AI as a bit of an umbrella term. Machine learning is a subset of AI, but there's other elements that sit under that same umbrella. So what we're seeing today, for example, with generative AI, is a subset of both of those. It would fit under machine learning. And then also, because machine learning is under AI, it's AI as well. For a long time, there were companies that were advertising what they did as AI because it sounds better. It's science fiction has taught us that AI is what robots do. This is the big smart thing. Machine learning is that's a nerdy thing developers talk about. It doesn't sound as cool. And so AI became the much more popular marketing term, and the nuance between the differences got lost. I would not consider myself an expert, but in broad strokes, the machine learning is any model you have where the machine is learning from a set of data over time. AI refers to a broad collection of technologies that are trying to approximate human intelligence using machines. So I think what we've seen with this latest version of generative AI is interesting because now the AI part of it is almost the less interesting. It's the generative part that's now novel. And AI is almost, if you're not using generative when you talk about AI, now that's old school, which is speaks to the pace of technological change. That's something that 5 years ago would have put you, on the top of the pace of innovation. Now is like a sideshow to generative AI, which is the big deal. And it's likely, in 4 or 5 years that there'll be something new. Yeah, we don't know what that's going to be. But this overall field, which continues to try and approximate human intelligence, continues to move forwards. And at some point in the future, that sci-fi version of AI may become reality. But today, we're not there. And every technology is just some approximation of some portion, some percentage of how humans actually think or how we are intelligent.
Okay. And so in your role, you're in charge of developing a product in SaaS, it's LMS, but what has the market been telling you over the last 2 or 3 years? What do you hear at trade shows? And do you guys listen to the market? How do you develop product and keep your ear to the ground?
Yeah, AI or any kind of innovative technology, it typically is, for us anyway, it starts more as a push. In the space we're in learning and development, we often may be the first to bring an innovation to our customer base, as opposed to waiting for them to ask us to be innovating in that area. I think part of that is because we have a very competitive space, and so there's a lot of different vendors trying to differentiate, and technology and innovation is a good way to do that. But also I think that the area of HR and training and learning is an area where people tend to be pretty careful. If you look at an area like sales or marketing, for example, they're often the first adopters because the risk is lower for them.
Right.
Whereas if you're dealing with people and you have to figure out how people will most use this technology, how you make it work with the way that they already are motivated, how they think, that adds nuance to it. So I would just say broadly, we think about innovation very carefully. We try not to just be a first mover for the sake of going quickly to get something to market so that, you can put a label on your website and say, hey, we're doing the latest thing, you should come look at us. Instead, we take what are already known problems, things that we know our customers are trying to solve already, and match them to upcoming innovations. So generative AI is a good example of this. you look at something like course creation, when you think about how customers would like to build courses, they would prefer that more content is made by subject matter experts than, dedicated course authors. It's been a problem for the entire existence of L&D. People have tried to solve it in various ways. They outsource, they spend money, etc. But now generative AI comes around and it's like, hey, we can maybe lower that bar for the level of effort it takes to create a course low enough that anybody can make a course. Like literally anybody. If you have enough subject matter expertise to craft a prompt or to upload a document you've already written and then, just review the content, congratulations, you're now a course author. So that is an example where I think when we take innovation from a perspective of a customer-first view, what are the problems they have, how can we bring technology to solve, and that's where we, Absorb, choose to innovate in that area.
And would you say, when you're looking feature, function, having roadmap discussions, like is AI the common thread in a lot of these discussions? Is it kind of the dominant theme?
Right.
You mentioned a marketing term, but the reality of AI right now is that I think it's coming to the point where it is important,
right? And
people are wanting that in their consideration set. Would that statement ring true?
It's definitely something we think about. I wouldn't describe it as a dominant theme. When we think about technology, our business and the product we provided was as much more impacted by, like AWS and cloud hosting as it was by innovations in AI, for example. Technology is kind of how we deliver solutions, and I view AI in that context.
Got it.
We, again, think about that roadmap. It's much more around like, what are these segments of customers and what are the problems they have? The fact is now, though, that some problems that have been around for a really long time that we've been like, we don't really know how to solve, so we're not going to bring that to the roadmap. Now we can solve. And so that's where AI is coming to the forefront. It's these old problems that we can now look at in a different lens, and that's really become a focus. But again, I wouldn't say dominant. There's still a lot of areas in our space, learning and development, that wouldn't necessarily be made better by AI, or maybe where it wouldn't be the first areas to go after. Because I think people also have to get used to it.
Sure.
Like we work in the SaaS space, right? We think about this all the time. But our end users, that's not always the case. Even when we surveyed our teams, like I had a conversation with the product and technology teams about how many people were using generative AI tools to help them do their jobs. They all work in technology. Half of them are, developers with degrees in this space. Less than half of them were using AI today already in some aspect of their job. And so then you think about, pushing that down to what our customers' audiences look like, what their admins look like, their instructors, their course authors. I think it's important that people get comfortable with the concept. I don't want to go make our LMS like AI everything. I don't want to go replace it all with AI yet. So I would say in 5 years, you'll definitely expect to see AI woven throughout the product, but I still at this point don't see that it's going to like replace, that our whole roadmap will just be, AI initiatives 1 through 10.
Yeah, got it. I do think it's fascinating though that AI will play a role to assist you and others developing products, whether they're LMSs or CMMS or whatever they are, in solving some of these long-tailed problems like return on investment.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a question that is asked universally to every SaaS vendor.
Right.
And do you see, has AI made any impact on that yet, to your benefit, or have you seen other examples in the marketplace where that might be true?
I don't have a great example that's coming to mind immediately as like a direct, like, hey, we couldn't measure it, now we have AI, now we can measure it. But there are, maybe one step removed. If we think about an area like what is the value of upskilling, for example. Prior to AI, you would have assigned courses out. Maybe you would have built group learning paths by job role or by seniority or something. It would have been not necessarily one size fits all, but still not personalized to the user. And so you might measure ROI by, okay, how many of my senior developers completed this? Or how many total courses did they take or something like that? Now, the version of that question today, you can build personalized learning paths with AI targeted to specific skill gaps to that learner and against specific career paths. And instead of answering how many courses did they complete, you could answer how many skills did they get. And even more valuable, if you're talking about ROI in that use case, you could be answering a question like, how many job roles did we fill internally that we didn't have to fill externally?
Sure.
That ROI can be measured at multiple levels in the organization. It saves money over recruiting and hiring costs. It helps improve employee retention, employee engagement. which most folks have other means of tying that back into their either top or bottom line. So I think that's a good example where the question of ROI, where it was trying to solve it in a generic way, now can be answered more personalized and then rolled up into a number, into a metric that can be measured. So that's what came to mind first for me.
Okay.
I have seen in other industries where AI can help answer ROI much more directly. You look at something like the customer success space, for example, or customer support, and you're trying to have ticket avoidance, for example. So your measurement of success would be how many less tickets were created as a result of this content. Well, previously, content was being generated by humans, hard to build, hard to update. Now generative AI can produce it off of your underlying artifacts that you built anyways. So you have more of this content. You can attribute ticket avoidance directly to those items. Immediate, obvious ROI, right? Now my support system avoids more support tickets. I'm saving money. I don't need as many support agents. I'm more efficient. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities in many different industries for that. But for LMS right now, I can't think of anything immediately that would be like AI directly enabling ROI.
It had to be asked. I mean, we've been asked that question together 1,000 times, if not 10,000 times, about ROI. And even in other SaaS industries, I still see that being a very popular question, and it's a tough nut to crack.
It is.
In terms of the inputs, so your programming engineering approach to building product, does AI have any benefits there? I'm just curious if you see that on the programming side.
So this is one of the benefits of the way I'll keep this less technical. And the way that these AI models work now is you can build specialized versions of them on specific domains.
Okay.
And so what we've seen is vendors like Microsoft bring out versions of their product that sit on top of their development tools that enable developers to build products faster. So they have a product called Copilot, which we rolled out in our organization and is now available to our development team. And it does simple things. It might make a recommendation as you're writing code for how you might want to finish it. It can also automatically generate things like test cases, which most developers will tell you is a pain in the butt for them. And so it helps save time in that regard. We're still in the process of measuring our own ROI of that implementation. Sure. But if you measure it subjectively, which we've done, just asking developers, for those who are highly adopted and those who are like really into it, it is having a significant positive impact on their efficiency. I would add an interesting note, though. Again, even in this very technological space, people who live and breathe, code all day, every day, and they think about all this stuff all the time. Not everyone is excited at the prospect or like immediately in arms wide open embracing it. So I do think that's fascinating. I wouldn't have guessed that. I would have assumed, this is the space you live in. Your world is always being disrupted. Yeah. That's what it means to be a developer. Most of your technology skills can be obsolete in 5 years or less in some of these cases. So it was interesting to me to see that AI is definitely being embraced by many, but not necessarily all. I think folks will come around as it becomes more natural, and certainly as the new generation of developers get more used to this, as they come up, it'll probably become a requirement, right? It'll be a dependency on those tools. But yeah, I'm really excited about the prospect. Compared to any other initiatives that you might spend money on or time on to try and deliver efficiency, it's pretty special when you find a technology or a tool that can enable this kind of efficiency at what is a relatively low cost for what it can deliver.
Well, you're talking about enablement here, right? There's sales enablement. You're talking about enabling your engineers, et cetera.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's exciting. Like we talk about AI all the time, in different conversations, but when you start thinking about getting efficient in your business and costs and just efficiency of development and lead time, it's really cool. I don't know how else to say it.
I agree.
That's a great example. Yeah. So one thing we did, Craig, throughout this season's podcast is we interviewed many of our customers, and we actually asked them about AI, and we've got some really interesting clips. So I'd like to introduce a few of them to you.
Sure.
We can watch them, and then we can just get some thoughts and spur some more conversation about, product and just the impact in L&D and even the business world. So I'd like to start. Hamish Knox of Sandler has a very interesting perspective on the role of AI and human replacement. So let's watch that one now.
In terms of AI, there's a cliche going out there about how we're not going to get replaced by AI. We're going to get replaced by a human who's using AI. And my thought is, well, if every person is using AI, then nobody's getting replaced.
Yeah. So this is an interesting concept, and I love that Hamish brought this up. Okay, I'll first say that I agree. I think that AI is going to, and is already becoming in certain roles. I don't think you get hired as an SDR now and not have,
For sure,
AI,
tool.
at least some knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yes, being comfortable using AI. If you are in a knowledge worker role, I'll clarify that not all jobs are going to get impacted by AI. But if you're in a knowledge worker role, you got to get comfortable with this, because I agree with Hamish. I don't think you're going to get replaced by AI, wholesale.
Right.
But if you're up against someone else who could be 5 times more productive than you because they've invested the time to learn how AI can specifically be tailored to their job, you're going to lose, right? Like it's not a 10% difference here. Some of the roles where this is having the biggest impact, it is a huge productivity increase, like total game changer. So I agree with him in that regard. I do, however, have to say, when you look at technological advancements that have occurred or innovations, a lot of the big ones have caused job losses. Sometimes a job type, goes away. Companies, sometimes entire industries. I always think of phone books when I think of this, but everyone probably has their own version of that product or that space in their mind that was like existentially important and then somehow so quickly just disappeared. And so I don't want to make light of the fact. I think in a role like sales, where Hamish is coming from, I don't see that sales is one of those roles that I think is just going to get replaced, by AI. But there will be, in our industries at large and in our countries and all of these places, I do believe that there will be some that just cease to exist as people look more and more to AI to solve some problems that it's really good at. And humans were, even if we were really good at, hard to compete with the kind of scale and cost you can get from AI.
Well, my feeling, and you're going to love this because it's an opportunity for companies like Absorb, is that we really need to train people on how to embrace and utilize AI in their day-to-day, because you're talking about efficiencies. You've already mentioned one previously with your programmers.
Right.
And if you're not embracing that, it's going to impact your efficiency when looking, across the bell curve.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's a massive role for training, actually, in companies that want to utilize and benefit from AI. I think there's a huge role in training folks correctly on how to maybe not respect AI, but utilize it within their day-to-day appropriately, have guardrails. Like there's a whole bunch of things you got to think about.
Yeah. We actually built a course for our employees as part of a policy as well to help educate them about it. We've also seen a lot of vendors in the space in the last 6 months rapidly roll out content on it. I do think there's a lot of different kinds. You're seeing some larger, very big organizations decide that AI is risky to roll out at scale. And so a lot of their training is about the risks of AI, the dangers of it, the concerns around it. And for some organizations, I get it, right? I mean, if you deal with, life and death type of data situations, then risking a hallucination in your AI, like that's a really big deal. But I think I haven't yet, although I've seen some of them, but I haven't yet seen it become mainstream about courses that are like, as a blank, insert job role here, how to use AI effectively. And so I think those will become more and more common. If you look at your LinkedIn feeds, you'll definitely see it's always sales who's moving first. They're sales, they're always selling. So you see them like they're pitching, hey, take my course. I've got training courses on this. But when you look at some of the big vendors, it's still pretty early days in terms of the kinds of courses that are out there to help teach people. But I would agree that this concept of upskilling has always been present and has become ever more important as innovation has become more rapid. This is one of those areas. It's a perfect case study for how you can take advantage of this opportunity with learning and activate your workforce.
Yeah, great thoughts. Great thoughts.
Yeah.
So Craig, Hamish continued in our conversation about AI to talk about the impact it's having on B2B sales and the buying process.
For sellers who are taking content that they find through an AI, whatever that might be, and blasting it out Well, God sent a messenger, and that's awesome. You and everybody else. It's completely undifferentiated, and in fact, it's probably quite annoying for the buyers.
Yeah. I don't know how much time everyone else spends on LinkedIn. I feel like I'm starting to spend an unhealthy amount there. But in the first 3 months after, Gen AI came out, it was like half of my feed was folks who were in the outbound marketing or outbound sales space. They were talking about how ChatGPT, they came up with the latest hack, the latest prompt that would generate that most personalized, unique message.
Right.
And I saw it go from the LinkedIn feeds to my inbox. I, like many of us, received many outbound emails about different products and services people are trying to sell me. And I couldn't pinpoint the shift, but there's a certain a flavor almost, if you will, to these AI-generated emails. And I don't know if I can put it into words, but I think once you see enough of them, you start to notice it. And it was fascinating to me because the whole purpose, the whole ROI behind using it is that it would feel more personalized to me, a prospect. And what actually wound up happening is they converged more quickly than they ever would have prior to these models occurring. They used to come in all kinds of different flavors. I'd get the, my name in the line or, my ROI in the first sentence or all the other tactics they tell you. Now with AI, there's a certain sameness to all of them, which is fascinating. And then back to Hamish's point, you've lost the point of using it in the first place, which is being differentiated. Now, I should clarify that there's always the risk of like a confirmation bias here, because maybe the good ones that are still coming through are also using AI, but they're using it well enough that I don't...
They're cloaked.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
They're using it in a way that is differentiated. But anyway, I do think it's a very amusing, as we think about these large language models, many of them are trained on the same set of inputs, and they're starting to run into problems. I say this as a layman. I don't know if these are real problems, but you hear about them running into problems where they're training now on AI-generated data.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that looks like in 2 years, but my guess is that there'll be an awful lot of, convergence in these answers, and all that they're going to have the same tone and the same flavor, and, God forbid, potentially the same misinformation that could have been generated previously. So, yeah, I totally agree with Hamish. You absolutely cannot rely on AI to differentiate yourselves now that everybody is using it.
Exactly. And I think, so in the B2B model, like, I run a sales operation, and we use ChatGPT as kindling, kind of like the kindling for a fire. Like if you're building a playbook and you've got writer's block, there's a way to stimulate some thought. Now, you're not going to take the output and that's your playbook. That's not the intent. But as I mentioned, it's kind of the kindling to the bonfire that gets you on your way. And I think there is use there. And I'm fascinated by some software in the sales floor, really. Like there's a company called Gong, which I know you're familiar with because I'm sure Absorb is using it in their sales floor. But, they're using AI to review interactions and in a really smart way, look at the buyer's journeys and be able to actually personalize those journeys by customer style, right? Like, so Absorb sales folks would have different conversations than, say, web TMA folks. But this AI is actually able to help folks who are trying to look in at both pipelines and decide where there's risk. And I think it's a fascinating utilization of AI. It's not doing anyone's job for it, but a lot of times pipeline management is identifying risk. And I think there is some sameness in some of the risks that are out there once you've been through someone's pipeline for a while and listened to calls and, there's tag words and that. The other thing I like to think about in B2B and in sales, and Hamish, of course, the sales guru himself, I think about flipping the script. Like people are looking for a sellerless buyer's journey, but what's going to happen when buyers start using AI to benefit their purchase and their purchase cycle? I think, we are going to see, things occur in that area in the next few years where we're going to have buyers who are well educated on what they're buying simply because they're using a tool that is taking advantage of the AI that's out there about the companies in their consideration sets. So again, salespeople might not want to hear that. That sounds like risky, but to me, it's like, look where this technology is going to take us. So yeah, go ahead.
Interestingly, when shortly after ChatGPT came out, we couldn't attribute all possible leads that might come from, but we got our first lead from ChatGPT within a matter of like weeks, I think, of it sort of entering the mainstream. And actually, the first reaction was kind of an oh crap moment because part of the challenge is ChatGPT at the time was very dated, right? So it was trained on data that was a year and a half out of date. And so when you ask it a question like, what are the top 5 LMSs, for example, you as like if it's reporting outdated information, now you have this product that people are coming to, and it's like it's not accurate.
Right.
Now I would say, of course, Absorb did show up if you asked that question, who was the top 5 LMS, but there were ways you could ask the question where we wouldn't show up, and there were lots of questions you could ask it that were wrong based on like what even at the time was accurate.
Sure.
So it's a very new area, and I don't know where it'll shake out. But yeah, we're definitely seeing buyers use it. And that's only the ones we know of where it's super obvious because there's like a link out to the Absorb website from it. I mean, who knows how many folks are using it to, write RFPs or help them draft requirements, help them review information around product capabilities. Like it's a powerful tool for a lot of those areas.
And I think the immediate result you would see from a buyer's journey perspective is shorter times to close. And not because of what your sales or my sales staff are doing, but because of what the buyers are doing. They're coming in more informed.
Right.
It is going to be very interesting to see where this heads in the next few years for sure.
I agree.
So Craig, we interviewed Devin Hasty of Anheuser-Busch, a fellow Canadian, huge hockey fan. He was the first guest on the podcast, and it was just a great interview. I'd encourage any of our listeners to go back and watch that. But Devin talked about the disruption of technology in education that could happen from AI. So let's watch this clip and see what he has to say.
If you put 10 10-year-olds in a room with technology and 10 adults in a room without technology and give them the same problem, that the 10-year-olds will come out with a better solution to the problem than the adults, which is really interesting, right?
I find it a fascinating thought experiment. There's a lot of studies on how groups work, which I think has an interesting dynamic to this. But if you just take the technology piece, you would have these kids, they'd have essentially the entire database of knowledge that accumulated human knowledge at their fingertips. And we all have that, with a cell phone in our pockets. The idea of being like locked off from it is kind of horrifying when you think about it. But these 10 kids, they have all the knowledge, but they wouldn't have experience. Right. They wouldn't necessarily know where to look, although I would also say that
they might not have context either, right?
Right? Yeah, they don't have that. And so I think that would be kind of their constraints. And then on the flip side, you'd have the 10 adults who would have that experience. They'd have, their own collective knowledge they'd bring into the room, but that would be it, right? Anything that wasn't in their memories, it wasn't already in their minds, they wouldn't have access to. And so if I had to, put a bet on this, I think I would bet on the kids, specifically because of one concept in the thought experiment, which is the idea that you don't necessarily know what the problem's going to be. I would give the adults the edge if it was a problem that any one of them, or perhaps some of them, had experience.
Right.
But if it's totally net new, like, you're asking a group of software developers something about like a medical problem, I would give the edge to the kids because they would have access to tools to be able to teach themselves, to go answer it. And AI is generative AI in particular, solving a really interesting problem, which is you don't even necessarily have to know where to look for your answer anymore. It can now index that for you in a very human way. You just have to know what questions to ask, which is not still the easiest thing, but I would take that bet. I would bet on the 10 kids.
So I think I agree with you. But the reason I agree with you, I think, is more to the point that the adults in their room having no access to data
right,
would be plagued by recency bias. And so I think that, when you've got access to data and the information that the other group would have, I just think it's to me, they've got the advantage. So,
So you're describing this in a case where the adults have experience in the problem, but it's like recent, they're not in-depth knowledge. They've,
it might not be such level. It could be a subjective problem or something that, if assuming the adults are, let's say, average age 35, we've all experienced a lot of things in our 35 years. But I find when I'm speaking to folks at work and outside of work, sometimes without data, like recency bias it's an issue.
Yeah.
And so it's just my own thought, but
just expanding on this a little bit, we see this in learning in organizations all the time. And I think about employee onboardings in particular as a good example, because it's this really condensed period of learning. if I were to kind of counter-argument my own, saying that the kids would win, I see, particularly with new employees, and I think I will assume that my experience at Absorb is relative to other companies, you can give them all the knowledge. You can give them these, big pages of here's where you can go find this information, and here's easy ways to find it, search capabilities, AI capabilities. But at the end of the day, when they want to learn something new that they're doing for the first time, 9 times out of 10, they want to go talk to someone else who's done it before. That is the primary question they ask. And like even having a simple buddy system or cohort learning approaches, which are much more popular these days in learning, giving that access to a peer, it's like you could do that and not do all the other stuff and probably still be successful.
Yep.
And I don't think you can do the opposite. I don't you see this with remote work and the impacts of just having, documentation and systems-based onboardings versus, a learning program that brings in instructor-led training, a learning program that brings in peers and community and collaboration. That latter program, I think, is much more successful. So in that context, I don't know if I'm changing my own mind here or
You're arguing with yourself.
It depends on the question or it depends on the problem.
I agree.
But I don't think experience can be underestimated in that regard. And knowledge is not everything. Anyway, interesting
concept.
question.
Yes,
Yeah.
Excellent. So Craig Devon Hasty had a really interesting comment about the ability for AI to support improve data insight and outcomes in learning and development. So let's watch his clip.
From an L&D perspective, we don't necessarily want people doing things they like to do or things that they may like to do. We want people to lean into things that they need to be better at their roles or their jobs. So I think the opportunity for AI into the future is to help us personalize learning journeys so that we're meeting the learners where they're at and that learners have the ability to lean into something that's going to help them A, be better at their job, or B, grow in their careers because they're leaning into their own personalized learning journey.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that you learn if you look at how adults learn versus how kids learn is there's a lot of differences. And when you think about how you want to build an LMS, you really need to tap into the adult learning piece because at least in my world at Absorb, we are not training kids, or at least, I don't know if you consider college students kids still, but, they're a very relative group. And so one of the big differences is adults need to know why. They need to know why they are learning a thing. And they also typically want to know it close to when it will be applied.
Right.
So like teaching them an abstract concept like a trivia topic, if you will, is not going to align well with the way most adults learn. And the why, you have to be very specific about the why. You can't necessarily rely on external motivation like a grade or giving someone, even points or a gamified model or dollars or anything like that.
Gold star.
Yeah. What's most effective for adults generally is tapping into their own intrinsic motivation. So where he's talking about this personalized learning paths, it really creates the opportunity to tap in to that motivation already by building learning paths that are specific to you as a learner and aligned with your existing why, which for most employees, it's a pretty safe bet that they care about their career path. And if learning can help them get from A to B to C, help them along that career path, that's an extremely powerful motivation to tap into. And we're really starting to see platforms in the last couple of years bring that to the table. And Absorb itself, actually, we've been working on this now for a while. We're really excited to talk about it in the next couple months here. But I couldn't agree more. I absolutely think that being able to personalize learning, which is only now being enabled by AI, I should add. This is not a new concept. I'm sure 10 years ago, people wanted to personalize still. But you can only do that for your senior leaders because it was so expensive. So now AI is kind of democratizing this, bringing it to the masses, and we're seeing it in platforms that are able to develop these personalized learning paths for learners.
So what is it about the input of AI that allows the development of this personalization at such a rapid pace?
It's about the number of data points. So if you think about what you would need to generate a personalized learning path for you, I would need to know a couple things. I would need to know what skills you already have today or what competencies you already have today. I would then need to know what job you have today. I would also need to know what skills and competencies are required for the job you have today. Then you have to know the job that you might be interested in or that you would pick or that your career would naturally evolve into, the skills and competencies required for that. Then do a gap analysis on those two things by measuring where you are today. And then you have to map all of that to a library of content, which has to be broad enough that it covers not just your skills and competency gaps, but also, 1,000 other employees at the same time. And that mapping is itself quite challenging because learners typically also have preferences. So you might prefer short form versus long form, or video versus, simulations or otherwise. So all of those things, it's like technically possible to do as humans. And you did see it again in programs 10 years ago, but it was just a huge scaling problem. And until AI came to the table, it would have involved, you might have had a dozen people in an HR team just trying to figure this out. And that would have been for a select group of your employees. Now AI can take on each of these steps. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't like immediately just make all this work. You need good data in. Any AI model that has bad data in will be bad data out. So you still have to, really work on the data and build up good pipelines and understand all those things, and make sure you have a loop to learn from as well. If I recommend you a course and you say, this is way too easy for me, I need to know that so I don't recommend it to the next Al. But yeah, AI is totally revolutionized this area and is really enabling personalization in a way that was just never before possible.
That's great, man. Great insight. Thank you for that. Yeah. So Craig, in our episode with Josh Rimorowski of Fortive, he speaks about the importance of quality and accuracy in AI and how we are checking for bias. So let's watch his clip and then we'll talk about it.
I think risks are what you're finding is AI is going to make people more lazy than they already are. And I think that's a dangerous thing from what type of information and quality of information are we providing? So I think if L&D professionals don't put in kind of the parameters that say, how are we checking this thing for accuracy? How are we checking this for bias?
Okay. First off, Josh, he's definitely on the money when it comes to the risks that are present with AI. A lot of these new technologies, people move to embrace them, and then the risks become apparent after they're embraced. And we kind of learn to live with them because the technologies have become so, we're so dependent on them now that there's no choice. AI is dangerous in a number of regards. The one I think Josh is referring to specifically is what if it generates a wrong answer?
Yeah.
What if it generates that answer in a way that propagates an existing bias, and that could lead to discrimination? These are real risks, and I definitely worry about them. I think in the context of learning and development, though, I would add some caveats to this. First, we're not an industry, generally speaking, that has to deal with high stakes situations. Where we do have some of those, if you think about training that maybe has regulatory requirements or otherwise really sensitive areas, I think that would be an example where you would not want to apply AI. But when I talk to our customers and I hear the problems they have, one of the biggies would be around content creation. And again, how do you build up this, knowledge base of this library of learning that can help train your employees, to train your customers, train your supply chain, train your vendors, all those areas. And the trade-off right now is you can either have information and it's accurate and it's human vetted, or you have nothing, right? Those are your two choices. Yeah. And generative AI brings a third choice to the table. And it's not perfect, but if that third choice is you can now generate more information, you can't guarantee its accuracy and it may come with some risks. But if it is able to answer these questions even 80% of the time, I think that for certain areas, particularly things like product training, internal processes, new product launches, things like that, I would take that risk. I would take the risk that it might be 20% wrong in exchange for knowing that it exists,
right?
And that you can get it out there. You can refine content over time. You can build feedback loops into your products, into your courses to improve the accuracy over time. But you can't iterate on nothing.
Right.
So I do think generative AI definitely has a space. It is not without risks. I completely agree. But for a lot of areas in which we work in, and I'm just going to totally stay away from everyone else's space because I don't have to worry about that problem other than as a citizen of the world. But for my area, I think the risk is worth it for most of the areas where we're talking about. In this example, again, content creation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to me, it's well, how do you fact check AI? Well, you can't, right? And so again, I'm going to go back to my comment earlier. It's about training. What are the guardrails you're going to employ? if you are going to embrace AI in your organization.
Right.
Just make sure you've got a clear set, they're concise, and they're easy to understand. And, they have to be somewhat pragmatic as well. So
Right.
Your identification of that risk and reward, I think, would be important in creating those guardrails, because as I just said, you can't fact check AI. It's
I will say on that point. So we're Absorb is going to be launching generative AI capabilities for our Create tool in the very next month and a half or so here. And one of the ways we're trying to solve for this is we're taking advantage of the existing reviewer concept we already have. So if you think about, you have a human build a course, most courses that get produced today don't get produced by one person. Right? It's not like one person who has all the possible knowledge you want. And often if they do, they're no good at making courses, or they're not interested, or they're too busy or otherwise. So most course authoring tools, including our Create offering, have reviewer functionality, collaboration capabilities, and it's used to review and fact check the human-generated information today. I believe we can leverage that same concept still for AI-generated content. So the model that we've built is the AI gets involved right up until it kind of comes into Create, and after that, now it's somewhat indistinguishable to content produced by a human, and you can bring in those reviewer steps and get your subject matter experts to fact check this for you. It takes it from a model where there's no involvement whatsoever by these folks to there's some level of involvement.
Sure.
But I think if that is something you're concerned about, you're worried about accuracy, you do want to go from 70, 80% to 90% or something like that, you can still bring in some of the exact same approaches we use today to validate and ensure content is accurate on AI generated content as well.
That's very well thought out. That's just great.
Yeah.
So finally, Craig, Brittany Warner of Sony Electronics, when we spoke to her about AI, she spoke about IP, copyright, plagiarism, and really authenticity of content.
Yeah.
So let's watch her clip, and I'm really interested in your points and ideas about this subject.
Some colleagues have shared things like, once you put something into program like a chat GPT, they actually own that content because you're utilizing it in their system. So just thinking about, intellectual property and things like that, and who owns that content, anything that we create here, what we're proud of is it's our, intellectual property here at Sony. But if you start working and interacting with, AI programs, who owns that? So I think about, those as, potential risks.
So I think Brittany talks about two topics here, and I'd like to address them separately. The first one was this idea of when you're using one of these products like a ChatGPT or otherwise, that the information you send to it is now owned by them. That actually depends on how you use the models or what version of them you use. So the open to the public free version of ChatGPT, or even the paid version of ChatGPT, that is absolutely true. The information you send back to it, part of your terms and services, everything you put into it, it's theirs now. And they're learning from that information, and they use it to make their large language model better. But that's not the only way to interface with what they have built. So at Absorb, actually, our generative AI capabilities sit on top of a different version of the same large language model, but in ours, the information we send does not go back to the vendor. So it stays, we essentially send a prompt over, it responds to that prompt, and it retains that prompt for a very short period of time, usually about 30 minutes or so. I think ours is hosted with Microsoft. There's different versions out there. They mostly retain it for quality assurance purposes. It does not go back to train the large language model. So that's really key, and you'll see this depending on how organizations have implemented this commercially. It's not a guarantee that they're taking the information.
Sure.
It's definitely something you should check on
and be selective in your choices.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think it'll be very difficult once these tools are in place to then after the fact try and put limits on how people will use them. I think it's much safer to make sure your system is architected with that safety built in, knowing that if someone does upload something they shouldn't have, well, it's not going to go anywhere anyway.
Right.
So that's the first point. I think the second point about what about the actual legality of how these large language models were trained? And that is an unanswered question. You've seen things now, so vendors like Microsoft, for example, and I think OpenAI has done this as well, are offering what basically amounts to indemnification. And they say, if you use our tools and you get sued for any reason because of it, we will cover it, which is a pretty bold thing to say for something that has really not been decided in courts. There is no answer yet as to how it will work. One argument is, look, these models are no different than if you had a human read 500 books, or if you had someone go out and read 500 web pages and then wrote an answer. In that context, you can't
interesting take.
Copyright this kind of understanding. The flip side is these companies are now generating massive commercial returns, right? The valuations of these companies are crazy.
Yeah.
And then the large language models, is that an original work? And again, not a lawyer. I don't have a legal opinion to share on it. All I can say is at this point is it's not decided. If you look, though, at previous technological innovations, once the cat's out of the bag, it usually doesn't come back. So if you think about the Napster case, for example, it's not like they made it illegal and then CD sales, were booming again, right? Instead, it led to things like iTunes existing, and which is in many ways a very similar concept of what Napster brought in terms of ease of use and how you can get access to this information. There was a cost associated with it, and they had to ensure they were paying the rights holders, but the concept was there. So if I had to make a bet, I would say that these concepts are here to stay. And if something will change through the courts, it'll be how those rights holders are compensated through it. So something other than zero. But I don't know if it's going to get crazy either. I mean, you look at Spotify as one of these examples of companies who is democratizing this, and they're doing crazy amounts. But it's a running joke among artists, the amount you get paid. I saw something the other day. For like 1 billion Spotify views, you might getting paid tens of thousands of dollars. So maybe they'll get paid out of it.Maybe they'll win the court cases, but they might also turn out that, what is the value of one sentence in one book by one author? Maybe you get 0.0001 cents.
It's interesting because this is the hot topic of AI.
Yeah.
And it's being talked about by book publishers, by music publishers, in learning and development. I mean, people are concerned about IP and copyright, and I don't think there's a clear answer.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be pretty interesting to watch what courts do decide. And again, neither of us are legal experts, but when you're feeding 200,000 published books into an engine to teach it, you got to wonder what the ramifications for that will be long term. And these folks that make their living through copyright, definitely we've seen an impact in the music world, as you alluded to.
Yeah.
But it's going to be interesting to see AI's impact across all rights, like artists and music artists, but people who just make their living based on their IP. It could be tough for them.
And books is tricky because they're somewhat analog, if you will. We've seen now some major publishers of web content figure out how to try and monetize their data. Places like Stack Overflow, New York Times, Reddit, they all have either implemented ways to try and protect themselves from having their data be scraped, or are monetizing APIs to try and have access to the data. So I do think that those kinds of companies, those people, will figure out sooner rather than later how to get compensated for what's on their platform. But that leaves an awful lot of people out in the cold. And as you said, you think of like an author or, an individual musician, your ability to get monetized independently is incredibly small.
Yeah.
And so I do think about it a lot.
Especially in AI. If your music influenced an AI engine to help write new music, it will be cloaked and literally invisible.
Yeah.
So
that's
a huge topic Brittany brought up, but very, very interesting one. Craig, I have to thank you for joining me today. This has been one of the most enjoyable episodes this year, and couldn't have done it without you, man. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you for having me out. It's been a pleasure.
Great.